So this is my Spyderco Southfork, designed by Phil Wilson, S90V. I picked this knife up about 2 months ago on eBay. I found a great deal on it, only about 150 bucks, essentially brand new. And over the course of that time, this past 2 months, I've done a lot of test cutting with this knife. I've done a lot of kitchen work with this knife, and just trying to use this knife as much as I could. And through that time, this knife has quickly become one of my favorite fixed blades. There's been quite a bit of complaints about this knife, specifically about one feature, and I guess considering the original design, considering this is a Phil Wilson design, I can get those complaints. I'll get to those in a bit, but overall, I tend to really enjoy this knife compared to a lot of people. A lot of guys thought this was just going to be a true blue Phil Wilson production, and that's absolutely understandable, considering, he designed the knife. But it's really not. Phil Wilson is known for what in most of the industry is extremely thin grinds and extremely high carbide steels. And this is S90V, so it meets that requirement. But one of the main things that people were mad about this knife was that behind the edge, it's roughly about 30 thou thick behind the edge, which for a Phil Wilson is about 3 times as thick, if not a little more than that, compared to most of his other knives. His knives very rarely go more than 15 thou thick, if ever. He doesn't make batoners, he makes fine cutting, often hunting, fishing knives. And so this knife got a lot of people getting mad because, they bought this knife saying, hey, oh, awesome, Phil Wilson design production fixed blade. I believe this is the first one that he's done in a production collaboration as well. And they get it, and it's nothing like a Wilson in geometries. Absolutely justified criticism. But in the course of me using this knife, in its own merits, I didn't look at it from the standpoint of, oh, this is a Phil Wilson, or, oh, this is supposed to be super thin. I just got the knife and used it just as it is. I didn't try to compare it to most other stuff. I just used it. And I've really come to enjoy this knife. I like these upswept blades. They work quite well. For me, I do a lot of slicing cuts. I rarely use the tip for a great deal of things. So if you have a nice upsweep or like a trailing point style, it doesn't really affect me. As you can see, it's a full tang design. Green G10 pinned handle with a lanyard tube. The guys at Tai Chung did a fantastic job on this knife. Everything is nicely rounded on the handle. Any contact points are very well rounded. You can't even feel the pins, any of that. You can't feel the transition between the tang and the scales. And very comfortable in hand. I've been mostly using it like this because I've done a lot of cardboard and wood runs just to, get a feel for how the knife cuts in soft, fibrous type materials and heavy cutting in hard materials like wood. I haven't really used this choil, and that's really one of my only serious complaints about this knife. I see a lot of knives coming out with these types of choils right here, and having nothing up here, because normally when I see a choil like this, my instinct is to wrap my hand like this to get really high up on the blade. Problem is, this part is stuck up on the web of my hand, this part of my palm, and so I get a big hot spot if I were to use it like that. And so having this choil right here, for me, over the course of this knife, has been kind of useless. I don't really know what you're cutting like this. I'm not saying you don't, but it's just I don't know what I would use this type of grip for. If I ever get this far up on the blade, I'm using it in a pinch grip like this. And so, yeah, that choil is basically useless. I wish it was brought down just straight flush with the top of the handle. But that's really my only ergonomic issue with this knife. It works well in a saber grip for a lot of slicing. This is what I was using when I was cutting cardboard. I've done probably 5 runs so far of cardboard, anywhere from 1,000 to 2,000 per run, and this grip was quite comfortable in this. This part of the handle, like I was saying, perfectly fine. The spine and choil area and up here is fairly square. Now, it is broken, so it's not sharp. You won't cut yourself on it, but it will, if you get your hand up on there for any extended period of time, it will give you some contact hot spots. Again, that's not a huge issue for me. I don't really do that much type of cutting, so it worked fine for me. This knife came with I would say 20-degree edge bevel, and it worked okay. You know, it's actually a pretty standard bevel for the industry, but considering this S90V, I didn't want to reprofile it to any extreme lengths. I did take it down to a 15-degree per side edge, and I've been enjoying the way it's working with that. Even at the 30 thou thick, 15 degrees per side, not bad. Because even under higher force that geometry may require for some cutting, this handle is so comfortable for me that it works just fine. I've been cutting, you know, one of those days I was doing wood and cardboard on the same day, and I probably did roughly 6 hours worth of cutting in one day, and I just had basic hand fatigue from, you know, my hand not being used to cutting for that length of time. No hot spots, everything was fine. Didn't have any problems with this geometry. I was even surprised at how well this knife batoned. You know, being this S90V, this steel is not known for toughness at all. And it batoned pretty well. I had no edge stability issues. Nothing like that. It worked pretty well. Now, I wasn't batoning, you know, 6-inch knots. It was just regular old pine and a couple of oak branches and things like that. I also, in the course of my wood cutting, wanted to test some edge stability on this thing, and I did some ramming cuts into a knot. There was probably about 20 ramming cuts, and the edge held up fine. The only time I started to see some microchipping in the edge was after the ramming cuts, but it was due to the fact that after I did those ramming cuts, I also did some very deep push cuts, intentionally not getting through the material, essentially biting way too deep and twisting the blade out to see if I could make the edge fail in any dramatic fashion. I couldn't. It was just very minute microchips. They came out with a micro bevel in less than a minute. But then that could be me, and I just need to take this edge lower, which I'm thinking about doing, but who knows. I also, considering this is Phil Wilson, I filleted fish with it. It didn't go fantastically, because even though I'm born and raised in southern Louisiana, grew up around New Orleans, that was actually the first fish I ever filleted. I'm not particularly fond of seafood besides crawfish, and my fishing experience basically extends to 2 catfish and 1 extremely pissed off softshell turtle. So I went and bought a fish. I cheated. I bought a whole fish and tried to fillet it. It worked okay. I would say any issues I had with that cutting was due to me and not the knife. It worked quite well. And it even worked quite well as a kitchen knife, especially compared to a lot of the knives I have in the drawer. Since I have non-knife people roommates, they typically have really smashed in and dented and chipped and just gnarly edges. And so this worked pretty well. Is it a kitchen knife? Not really. But could it serve? I certainly think so. What else? The sheath is a Bolotron sheath. Spyderco is known for these. This is what they use. Functionally, it's essentially the same thing as Kydex. The only serious difference I've noticed from this material is that I would say Bolotron's is slightly harder than Kydex in its non-heated state. But other than that, it's pretty normal. And one other cool thing is the guy I bought this from, because I bought it used on eBay, like I was saying, he melted in a little thumb shelf to help extract the knife. and I think that thing works really well. It's not super pretty or, aesthetically pleasing, but functionally, it works really great, and I think that's really something they should have put on the stock sheath. Also has the G-clip. Most people either love them or hate them. It's sufficient for my purposes. But yeah, good solid sheath. Works well for me here in southern Louisiana. Doesn't get cold, so I don't have to worry about it cracking. And if any gunk ever gets in it, it's easy enough with a drain hole to just run it under some water, rinse it out, tap it, and let it dry, and sheath is good to go. Really nice, functional sheath. This is a Tai Chung model, and I have to say the Tai Chung guys, in my opinion, really knocked it out of the park. The, expectation issues notwithstanding, everything's flush, everything's ground well. They just did a really fantastic job. And even though I got this knife on a discount, for me personally, I would still say I would have gladly paid the roughly $240 that this knife costs full price. I know some people kind of scoff at that, but I mean, price is relative. I don't want to get into a whole debate about value and all that stuff. I'm glad I got this knife. This knife gives me a great deal of enjoyment. I enjoy using it, and yes, even despite that relatively thick edge bevel, it still works quite well. The nice high flat grind reduces drag, slices well because of the belly. It's just a really functional piece. One thing I would like to see too, because I just like this knife as a pattern, just a general utility knife. Even if this was 8CR13 MOV, I would probably still buy this knife just because I enjoy working with it. I think this would be a good knife pattern for Spyderco to experiment with other steels like Super Blue or 52-100 or something to give you, or maybe even AEBL, to give you kind of a idea of how the different sorts of steels perform. Because I think this is a very multifunctional design for a lot of people. It can work for a lot of different applications, especially due to the thicker edge geometry that can allow people to do a lot of stuff like batoning and some harder cutting. And other steels, I think, would benefit this design well. And it could sort of use it as almost another mule series. Well, I know, they have the mule series for a reason. I would like to see this knife in other steels. One good thing, though, about the Phil Wilson lines is that for those people who were kind of disappointed in this knife and its geometry, Spyderco has announced at this latest Amsterdam meet the Sprig, which is based off of Phil's Bird and Trout design, and it's the same aesthetic feel as this, same type of handle, Bird and Trout blade, so it's that kind of spear point-ish blade, but it's a similar theme to this, still S90V, but it's supposedly going to have that more Phil Wilson-esque geometry that people were hoping for in this knife. But, yeah, just to close it out, a knife that I really enjoy. I've really gotten to love this knife. It's one of my go-to fixed blades, even though I realize it's not perfect for everything, especially the steel and stuff. It's just, to me, a really enjoyable knife to use. And I can't wait for the Sprig to get out so I can compare it to this one. So that's pretty much it, y'all. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions or comments or anything, please put them down below. Thanks.